Welcome to Alternative Perspectives, a podcast by the Centre for Applied Law and Technology Research by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. Today we're going to talk about this book I read recently. It's called Midnight's Machines, A Political History of Technology in India. It was written by Arun Mohan Sukumar. And we have Arun with us here today. This book chronicles India's changing attitude to technology, both of the Indian public and Indian politicians, and how these attitudes of the public and the politicians have interacted with each other. It also talks about the dissonance in these attitudes that has happened at many points. It talks about India's relationship to the rest of the world and how that has affected its adoption of technology. Talks about small technology involving bullock carts, but also big technology involving space, nuclear energy, and of course, information technology. What I really like about this book is that it's readable. It has many interesting stories that you won't find anywhere else, but also lays out the broad trends that have happened in India's tryst with technology. Hi, Arun. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jai.
So, while you were writing this book, apparently you were up to a bunch of other things as well. So, obvious question, I suppose. Apart from the fact that such a book has surprisingly not been written yet, why did you decide to write this?
I think part of the motivation for writing the book was I had been at ORF, the think tank in Delhi, for, at that point, I think 3 to 4 years. And most of my engagement with the space, if you will, has been on technology policy. So a number of issues had cropped up in this space for perhaps the first time during this period between, I'm talking about the period between 2014-15 to, you could describe the present time. And we were, encountered by these issues such as net neutrality, encryption, and so on and so forth, issues that came up for the first time, and to which positions were quickly adopted. And, I felt non-reflexively hardened. And I wanted to perhaps study in context how Indian society, for lack of a better word, engaged with debates on technology when they encountered them for the first time. And this would mean that I expanded my analysis to issues that were way beyond the realm of digital technologies. But I figured that some of this has to be historical, the way in which different constituencies in society responded to changes in technology. This had to have happened in the past, and it did. And so that was really the motivation for understanding how politics in particular interacts with technology and creates certain sort of ripple effects in different, like I said, different constituencies in society. And when I began writing the book, I think one of the assumptions that I had was India being this sort of, consociational setup where different elements of society exert pressure on their political representatives and, extract concessions from the executive or the legislature, if you will, and they sort of they create the pushes and pulls that are involved in technology policy. And what I found, this is of course my interpretation of policy making in India and debates on technology in India, that as with any modern society, the elites in India have exerted considerable sort of influence, undue influence over how India has absorbed technologies. But I'm not sure whether these, the elite positions are necessarily a reflection of what society demanded or was in need of at any particular point of time. So that to me seemed like an aha moment while I was writing the book. And the book's argument, as you know, is that a lot of it has to do with the political pressures or the political context into which India was born. And our initial thinking on technology was shaped by factors that had very little to do with our economic conditions, and a lot to do with our political and even cultural conditions at that time. As a result of which, elite thinking about technology began to be shaped in a very rather curious or unique way, and which has continued to dominate our thinking towards new technologies, including digital technologies. It started out at with one purpose, and I must say it ended in a totally different directions. But I thought this is one interpretation that would perhaps be received with interest, with at least people who are interested about who are sort of involved in the day-to-day business of thinking about what technologies India should embrace and what policies should be in place to regulate or welcome them.
Right. Yeah. So you did talk about societal needs and how our policies probably did not reflect them. A big part of what you were talking about was the lack of focus on items for consumer use. So just, consumer electronics, for instance. How do you assess today's India, where access to consumer electronics is perhaps quite a lot easier than before, and it is the defining nature of the individual's interaction with technology in India today, and whether you think that has adequately delivered the economic and other benefits that it should have?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I look, I don't think I would like to believe that I'm not naive enough to believe that greater access to technology by greater numbers of the Indian population will necessarily result in a democratization of tech policy making as well. I don't think that will happen. But the fact is that the circumstances, like I said, the circumstances that dominated our thinking on how technology should be regulated in, say, 1947, in the early 50s, certainly are no longer exist today, on account of the fact that, as you said, most Indians have a relatively affordable access to consumer electronics, because the quality and the nature of those electronics differ from different, is on a spectrum. But the fact that many Indians today have access to these consumer electronics certainly has shaped in a modest way India's thinking towards technology as well. I think we are more positive and receptive of technology as a society than we were, at a certain point in the past. I'm not sure whether that is going to change this technology skepticism that I note has sort of dictated our approach to new technologies at various points of time in our history as an independent country. And that may be because this elite perception of technology is still sort of oriented towards cynicism. It's difficult to pinpoint why that elite skepticism is. In the book, I argue it has to do with the fact that some of it is certainly this Nehruvian strand of thinking, where the elite has taken on this view of patronage, of we are in a good position to determine what technologies are good and what technologies are bad for India. So I say it is a Nehruvian style of thinking because in the 50s and 60s, you had this debate about appropriate technology, about technology that is labor intensive and not necessarily resource intensive. Some of it, I argue, was dictated by political factors, calculations, because of India's relatively low forex reserves, which limited the import of expensive equipment. The fact that Nehru and the political class in India were essentially heirs to Gandhi's political legacy. And Gandhi, as you know, had a very sort of cynical view towards machinery. So a lot of factors came together to create a cynical view on behalf of the elites towards technology, which I believe is quite strong in India today as well. So this is not something that was isolated to the 50s or 60s, continued in the 70s, 80s, as India began to slowly embrace computers and IT outsourcing. The companies that sort of provided employment to hundreds of thousands of Indians for the last 3 decades. These were met with skepticism, cynicism in their early years, and met with cynicism by elites. And I am not sure whether that cynicism was a reflection of any cost-benefit calculations that were made on behalf of Indian elites. For example, I highlight the report of the Committee on Automation that was set up in 1972, just as India began embracing computers, especially in public sector units. The Dantikar Committee, which was set up in 1972 to examine the effect of automation on labor in India. The report itself says that it could not find any discernible impact on payroll as a result of computers being introduced in the workforce. In fact, the report even went on to say that there could possibly be net gains. It acknowledged that some people would lose jobs, but on account of the jobs that were needed to train people and to use computers effectively in the workplace, the report even said that there could be a net gain for Indian labor as a whole. But at the end of the day, the report was received and adopted in a political context, in the context that is of trade union protests in the 70s in Bombay and other cities. So the political calculations of the government at the time influenced the decision to adopt, or to reject, in that case, reject the introduction of computers into the workplace. And this thinking of, or rather this approach that is largely cynical towards new technologies continued even as we sort of saw the green shoots of an Infosys or a TCS first time in the 80s and subsequently. If you look at the newspapers of the time, there is a lot of skepticism on behalf of the commentariat, if you will, towards these new companies being, cyber coolies or body shoppers. These pejorative terms are, they've begun to apply these pejorative terms to companies that would go on, like I said, to provide employment to a large number of Indians. I'm not debating the terms of those employment or whether Indians, whether ordinary Indians were receiving a fair bargain by participating in such knowledge production or technology production. I'm merely saying that the skepticism of elites at the beginning stages of these, introduction of these technologies seems to have been dictated by some kind of innate skepticism, which I found difficult to understand except through a political lens.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose that even questions like whether automation would result in job loss, or whether even just the introduction of simple computers would result in job loss, would depend a lot also not merely on the introduction of the technology itself, but also on several policy choices made in the background of the introduction of technology. So
yes.
It would be obviously really strange of us today if we are having this conversation based on consumer technology to, having this online on an app to patronize opinions on consumer access to technology. But speaking of external factors that have dictated India's approach to technology, you've written in the book a lot about technology in the context of the Cold War. Do you today see some parallels given the relationships, the increasingly frigid relationship between the US and China?
Yes, absolutely. I think we like various points in history since our independence, I think we stand to be affected by this so-called tech Cold War between the US and China. But just by way of background for your listeners, I think the 2 points in history that I document where external conditions had played an important role in India's adoption or rejection of technology is 1945 and in the late 80s, the early 90s, just as the Cold War sort of had begun to draw down. In around about the time of independence, India was confronted with the reality that export control regimes were popping up just as the World War had ended, to prevent the quote unquote proliferation of sensitive technologies to either satellites of either the United States or the Soviet Union. And India was caught in the crosshairs of many of these export control regimes. Also, another important factor that needed to be considered was India was owed a lot of money by Britain on account of being a contributor to war efforts, but because of the conversion of sterling debts to dollar pretty much overnight on account of a secret agreement between the US and the UK, our capacity to access technologies or to use these debts that were owed to us to the purchase of technologies was severely limited. So that was one point in history where external conditions played a pretty consequential role. Even if we did want to buy new technologies that time, we were limited by what we could. And then, of course, towards the end of the Cold War, a similar sort of environment persisted where the US, the ultimate victor of the Cold War, wanted to create a number of non-proliferation or further strengthen existing non-proliferation regimes to prevent sensitive dual-use technologies from landing in the hands of a number of countries that had attained independence. The third wave of decolonization was happening pretty much at the same time. So, these states that were released into the international community at the end of the Cold War, the US wanted to prevent those technologies from reaching, the hands of dictators or rogue governments. And India, once again, was caught in the crosshairs of those non-proliferation regimes. And I also document in the book the access to the negotiations that led to India's acquisition of a supercomputer, and how the United States pretty much blocked the purchase of the supercomputer that we wanted from Japan, and then negotiated our access to a supercomputer of a previous generation and not the one that we wanted, on account of these, sort of standing on the shoulders of these non-proliferation agreements. To your question, do you think, whether the relationship between the US and China will affect us? Yes, absolutely. For example, one thing that we are concerned about today is the integrity of technology supply chains. A lot of it has to do with China, certainly. So in pretty much any international forum that we are negotiating on cyber issues today, we raise supply chain integrity as something of paramount concern, because we are worried about what China puts in these technology supply chains, and whether our strategic assets or even civilian assets are compromised by malware or tools of surveillance that China embeds in technology supply chains. We are worried whether the prevailing environment of antagonism between the United States and China will limit, once again, our access to capital. Because I would imagine that the startup ecosystem in India would want access to capital from both the United States and China. And that may be prevented if there is a tightening of screws in Washington, D.C. that dictates what Chinese capital can or cannot do. So we stand to be affected, I think, once again, by the current state of relations between the two major powers in the world.
Yeah, related to that, you've talked about how the IT industry that we know today rose on the back of Y2K and a bunch of Indian workers, engineers, fixing the bugs that the Y2K crisis threw up. That's how we ended up finding our place in the global value chain of technology, and whether that was fair or not, that was the place we found. What do you think strategically should be the place we look for in the future in technology value chains? I mean, is it really fair for us, like you said, to sort of pick a side in this Cold War, or even outside the context of this Cold War, what is it that India should be aiming for?
Yeah, I think the challenge for us, which is hardly a new revelation, is the difficulty in moving up the technology value chain, as you phrased it. I think we started out providing services to the lower end of the value chain, but it's easy to point this out with the benefit of hindsight. The fact is that at that time, and even today, most essential infrastructure, leave alone essential infrastructure, even private sector infrastructure that runs on the internet, is built on, frankly, obsolete code. So what India did in the 80s and 90s leading up to the new millennium was to fix problems in that code that was increasingly getting obsolete. So you could say now that this is marginal innovation, or this is providing innovation at the lower end of the value chain. But at that time, we were responding to a real need in fixing certain aspects of code-based aspects of digital infrastructure. And Y2K, I think one of the big revelations for me after having written the book and knowing, being acutely aware of what Y2K was. So maybe this is something that was, familiar to me on account of working in this space. But the number of people who have since approached me after reading the book and saying, look, we knew nothing about India's involvement in the resolution of the Y2K crisis is frankly staggering. I think that was a significant moment for both India and how India was perceived in the world. This whole conversation about India being a superpower, IT superpower, all happened on the back of Y2K. So while I agree with most people when they say that we have not really made advancements in moving up the technology value chain. This was a significant, intervention by India in responding to a problem that the world faced in the run up to Y2K and still does. That is why you see the bottom lines of companies like Infosys and TCS being lined up over the course of the pandemic. I mean, they've recorded incredible profits on a quarterly basis over the course of the last 1 year or so. And that's because much of the digital infrastructure that is essential to enterprise running and management in the world today is still sort of run on a pretty obsolete code. And we still need those companies. And those companies, I think, are doing their best in their defense to innovate and try to move up the value chain. But it cannot happen except through manufacturing advancements. I think what we also try to sell ourselves is this narrative that companies like Infosys and TCS are here to stay forever. And India can be this services-led economy and does not really need to focus beyond a point on manufacturing. I think what has happened with China leaving us far behind in the dust is this acknowledgement that you also need to place emphasis on your manufacturing sectors, especially manufacturing of certain strategically relevant sectors, such as semiconductors, biotechnology, or what you will, and increasingly on hardware and software related advancements relating to machine learning and artificial intelligence. Unless we are able to sort of build on these manufacturing abilities, it is unlikely that we are able to move up the value chain. I hope it happens, but this is a sort of, I think it's an ongoing conversation. It will take many years for us to resolve. And some of these conversations may not be a purely domestic one, whether India is able to sort of advance with respect to semiconductor manufacturing, etc., is as much a political question as it is an economic or a technological one. So the same thesis that I started out with the book, which is that politics essentially is a crucial determinant of the way in which India embraces or adopts or rejects technology, is likely to be true for the future as well.
Yeah. Surely, if we wanted to move up in the value chain in services, we would need a whole new ecosystem, not only for technical education, but also for preventing what is often called brain drain out of technological education. And I don't see apart from, like, I see what's happening in education policy is of a an emphasis on vocational training rather than, so that seems like aspiring to the lower ends of the value chain actually, and not even focusing that much on manufacturing.
Right. I think, this too, you could draw a historical analogy to it, which is our emphasis on IITs and not on ITIs. You had the ITIs, you've had national conversation, for lack of a better term, is still focused on the IITs. They have naturally a pride of place in Indian society, given it's so difficult to get into IITs and the prospects that are, and the fact that it is today possible to come from a very disadvantaged section of Indian society and still make it to the IITs. Of course, how you sort of deal with your time in IIT is a different question altogether, but it's still possible to access these institutions despite all the inequalities of education in India. So they are treated, they are placed on a pedestal, but their emphasis have come, unfortunately, at the cost of vocational training that's needed to build up certain important skills. So I think in the initial years of Modi, you had the Prime Minister talking about the fact that an automobile engineer graduates out of an engineering institution but does not have any cars to tinker around with. So he was saying the right things, but I'm not really sure whether this government too is sort of, I'm not an expert on education policy, so maybe the NEP will change things. But the fact is that every government since Nehru has sort of has had its attention, deflected towards these premier institutions, setting up IITs and AIMS, All India Institutes of Medical Science in different states. These sort of prestige projects, as opposed to building skills that may help us in sort of building manufacturing capabilities.
Yeah. And this is my final question. So you've consulted a wide variety of sources, I think, bunch of letters, speeches. Did you have any trouble accessing them? Where did you spend most of your time reading, looking for stuff?
Yeah, I have not used a single Indian archive archive, as in like an archive located in India for the research. There was a set of personal papers that I wanted to access from the Nehru Memorial Library for the research. Unfortunately, at the time that I wanted to access those personal papers, they had not been catalogued, and there was some issue between the agreement had not been signed between the person who contributed the papers and the library itself, so I could not access it. But beyond that, and other things such as Nehru's Nehru's correspondence has entirely been digitized. So I was certainly aided by the fact that a lot of the information that traditionally used to be based in archives had been digitized. But I was greatly aided by the fact that I was in the US at the time and could have access to records that could possibly, I would be very surprised if even Indian archives had certain records of government committee reports that were available in US libraries, especially the Van Pelt Library, which is a library of record for South Asia in UPenn. So I had absolutely no difficulties accessing those records by virtue of the fact that the university that I'm enrolled in had access to this interlibrary lending service. So archives were not particularly inaccessible. It helped, but unfortunate, it helped that I was based in the US and could access these resources in a way that would have been difficult, ironically, for somebody who would be based full-time in India or affiliated exclusively to an Indian institution.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Is there anything else you want to add about the book or the topic?
Yeah, in addition to encouraging those listeners of yours who haven't read the book to buy it and read it, also to, I think there is a sense of here and now that characterizes our response to technology policies and new technologies. And the younger generation in India is naturally a consumer of new technologies and a critic of them at the same time. We are bombarded by information that tells us what to think about a new technology and what not to think about that technology. And I think it is important to place some of these debates in context. There may not be any perfect analogy to characterize, our response to drones or machine learning or anything or cryptocurrency. We may not have the tools necessary to come at a fully informed decision. But I think as students of technology policy, especially lawyers, I think we have to be responsive to factors that have traditionally influenced our approach to technology. I think some of these reasons are rooted definitely in the Indian economy. Some of this is without doubt a factor of politics and culture. And I think lawyers have to go beyond reading what a policy says or what a regulation says in black letters and to understand what might be some of the motivations, good and bad, of those technologies. And where possible, some of this is in my book, but it hardly scratches the surface of technology debates that have characterized the evolution of India from 1947 to the current moment. So they should certainly make an active attempt to find out how some of these debates have been viewed in the past, who have been the important players, how have industry groups responded to the adoption of new technologies, and in particular responded to the entry of foreign competitors. I think these are things that have some answers in history, and I think we should be looking to those debates for some guidance at least.
Great. Thanks so much, Arun, for your time today. Thanks for coming to the podcast.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.